A Chinese professor's remark is sparking controversy. She claims the pandemic brought China more than $10,000 billion in profit. Chinese police hire thugs to monitor a couple 24/7 for 4 months. They won't let them go to the hospital or go out to buy groceries. A Chinese expert breaks down how China has influenced U.S. politics in recent decades. One of the key words is Wall Street. The U.S. House of Representatives passed a law to delist Chinese companies if they do not fully comply with the country's auditing rules. Over 1,000 Chinese researchers have fled the U.S. since this summer. They had hidden their ties to the Chinese military. And the Australian federal government will now have the power to veto any deal struck between local authorities and foreign governments. The move is with the CCP in mind. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Now we turn to a controversial comment from a Chinese professor. She claims the virus pandemic brought China over $10,000 billion in profit. That's more than 2/3 of China's GDP this year. Professor Li Ling works at the prestigious Peking University, known as China's Harvard. She's now facing backlash over her claim. A Wuhan resident whose father died from the virus called Li's comment disrespectful of the dead. Speaking to Radio Free Asia, he said the professor's remark has hurt the family members of those who died from the virus. Adding such propaganda will create the illusion that disasters bring profit. One internet user wrote following Li's claim, "Won't China become the world's largest economy should the virus pandemic hit again?" Li's comment is also in line with one of the communist regime's typical methods of controlling the public, putting a positive spin on disasters and other forms of suffering. Back in July, while Wuhan endured extreme flooding and property damage, state media praised the city's scenery after the heavy rain stopped. The same month, when residents near China's biggest fresh lake were reeling from the rising floodwaters, state media posted a video of a flood-submerged road, saying the most beautiful road above water has emerged. At the time, one Chinese internet user commented, "Our mainstream media is trying to create a beautiful world for us. In this world, the flood didn't damage any roads, crush any bridges or homes, or wash away any cars." In China, if you are too vocal for your rights, the local authorities might hire gangs to silence you. A case in China sees a woman being imprisoned in her home for 4 months. This is after she complained to Beijing about her rights being violated.
In China's coastal province of Jiangsu, a woman and her husband have been illegally imprisoned in their own home for 130 days. This is after they tried to report a case of injustice to authorities in Beijing. In 2006, Wang Caixia and her husband had their 2,000 square foot home and her nearly 1,000 square foot business illegally demolished by the local government. She also suffered injury to her knee due to a hospital's improper treatment. She took these 2 cases to court, but over 10 years the cases have not been resolved. A few months ago, she went to voice her case to the central government in Beijing. But as she went, she was intercepted and escorted back home. Since then, she's been illegally detained in her own home. She suspects that her local police station hired people to stop her from being able to voice her rights. Wang told us that 4 men have set up tents in front and behind her house, preventing her from leaving. The men are not authorities. They're not letting her go to the hospital, even though she suffers from high blood pressure, heart disease, and chronic liver problems. She's not even allowed to buy groceries. This situation has been going on since July. On Thursday, she called the police over to her home, and after talking to him, her suspicions were confirmed.
我们被非法拘禁到现在已经129天了。
有这个事情吗？
没有这个事情吗？你看这个凳子，这个人不是吗？
我现在怎么说呢？
现在我就是问你们这么说，你们是人民警察，应该就是恢复我们的人身自由，就是制止。
我们没有限制你们的人身自由。
你们没有真的啊？
那没有呀。
那包拿过来，我出去。
那个我这样吧，
包拿过来。
我跟我们领导汇报一下，好不好？
不是你说没有限制吗？那怎么还要汇报呢？你这个不是前后，这个不是前后矛盾吗？你这个不是啊？刚才你还说没有限制，现在你要说要跟领导，你说了别跑呀别！今天打了你已经第3个110了，是吧？你人民警察，你应该依法履行你的法定职责，你为什么你就这样找呢？是吧？ 你出境你怎么找了？你怎么？你跑了？大家看看啊！
After talking with the police, she went to confront the men.
你是哪里？你是谁？你是谁？你哪里来的？你是谁？谁叫你非法进行我人身自由的？你是谁？你们是哪里来的？你叫什么名字？你是哪里来的？我想问，是哪里来的？你是哪里来的？你说啊，你是哪里来的？你是谁？为什么限制我人身自由？啊，为什么限制我人身自由？你说啊，为什么？你是谁？你是谁？你说，回答我，你是谁？你是哪里来的？
For several minutes, she questioned them, but they wouldn't answer her. For more than a decade, Wang's husband has not been vocal about the violations of his rights. Recently, he could not bear it anymore. He went to the National Bureau of Voicing Concerns in October. Once there, he received abuse by authorities and was escorted back home. He then was arrested on charges of picking quarrels and provoking trouble, but was later released on bail with a trial pending.
Physical torture is a common practice in Chinese prisons, but there are also many means to drive prisoners insane without any trace.
A human rights activist in China's eastern province of Jiangsu revealed some unusual mental torture methods that he saw during his imprisonment in the city of Nanjing. Shi Tingfu was detained and sentenced to prison in 2017. He was accused of what authorities called provoking trouble and creating disturbances. In reality, his crime was educating others about what had happened during the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. That's when Chinese soldiers fired against unarmed pro-democracy citizens and students, killing thousands. But according to the Chinese Communist regime's narrative, the massacre never happened and no one died under soldiers' fire. Shi Tingfu witnessed how jailers tortured people inside the detention center. He told NTD that prison guards inside the Gulo Detention Center in Nanjing City, now called the Nanjing No. 2 Detention Center, used various methods to intentionally drive people to insanity. Some of their tactics may not appear like torture at first glance, but when a prisoner is forced to endure them for hours or even days at a time, they become acts of severe mental torment.
They are attached to a small cloth strip with paper and put it about 16 inches in front of your eyes, and then tilt them a little bit and ask you to look at it. If you move your eyes, the jailers would beat you, or they ask you to walk back and forth. But it's not a normal walk. You have to walk between your toes and the heels and walk back and forth all day. Normal people could become mentally ill in 10 to 15 days.
Shi Tingfu also described how the jailers would attempt to destroy inmates' sense of dignity.
The jailer calls a prisoner over, repeatedly slaps him in the face, then asks him to open his mouth, and then the jailer spits into the prisoner's mouth, making the prisoner feel disgusting and later vomit.
According to reports about Chinese prisons, common torture practices also include shocking prisoners with electric batons, forcing them to sit, stand, and squat for long periods of time, locking them in single-person cells for days at a time, force-feeding them excrement and urine, depriving them of sleep, subjecting them to sexual abuse, and even murdering them via live organ harvesting. Reporting by Chen Han, NTD News.
Now we turn to a Chinese expert who broke down how China has influenced U.S. politics in recent decades. He's the vice dean of the School of International Relations of a top university in Beijing. During a panel discussion with China's financial elites last Saturday, he first threw out a question: why can't we handle the Trump administration? The U.S. and China have long been at a standoff, most notably since President Trump took office. Di Dongshen, associate professor at Renmin University of China, commented on the relations between the two nations. He says that before Trump was elected,
just like fights between couples that don't last long, all the diplomatic crises between the U.S. and China could be settled within 2 months. Why was this?
As for his interpretation,
because we have high-level connections. We have our old friends in the United States core power circle. Do you get it? Round of applause if you get it.
He added that China has been embracing its ties to Wall Street. Its influence over U.S. politics and diplomacy had been on the rise in recent decades.
But the problem is Wall Street's influence started to lessen after 2008. What's more important is after 2016, Wall Street couldn't handle Trump.
Di claims sources told him that Wall Street tried to help China during the trade war, but the efforts didn't have much impact.
But now we're seeing Biden come to power. He's a traditional elite, political elite, a pro-establishment elite. He has very close relationships with Wall Street.
Dee also touched on Biden's son Hunter, questioning who helped Hunter Biden build up his investment firm, and adding, "Do you get it? There were deals behind it." The U.S. House of Representatives passed a law to delist Chinese companies if they do not fully comply with the country's auditing rules. This gives President Trump one more tool he could use against Beijing.
The U.S. House has passed a law to put Chinese companies under closer scrutiny and could see them delisted if they don't follow tighter rules. It would bar any foreign companies from listing on a U.S. exchange if they fail to disclose ties to foreign governments. But the legislation is intended to target Chinese companies such as Alibaba, tech firm Pinduoduo, and oil giant PetroChina. The Chinese embassy in Washington did not immediately respond to a request for comment. However, before the vote, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying called it a discriminatory policy that politically oppresses Chinese firms. Measures taking a harder line on Chinese business and trade practices generally pass Congress with large margins. The Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act is now headed to Trump, who is likely to sign it into law.
Now we turn to Chinese researchers in the U.S. According to the Justice Department, over 1,000 Chinese researchers have fled the U.S. since this summer. They had hidden their ties to the Chinese military. This happened after 6 Chinese researchers had been accused of hiding their affiliation with the Chinese army when applying for a U.S. visa. After that, the U.S. authorities warned that individuals of this kind needed to leave or face arrest. Trevor Loudon, an expert on radical left and Marxist movements, says pro-Communist China voter registration groups are helping flip U.S. elections. NTD's Miguel Moreno has more on Loudon's investigations into the CCP-affiliated network.
Just when you think the election couldn't get any more controversial, in an interview with American thought leaders, expert on Marxist radical left movements, Trevor Loudon said pro-Communist China organizations in the U.S. have worked to try and flip the election. He says that Liberation Road, a socialist Chinese-directed group that has close ties to the Chinese regime, is involved in the registration of voters in key states like Georgia and Arizona.
They are the same people who are involved in several large voter registration organizations in many of the key states in question. I'm talking Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona. I have them in their own words talking about how they targeted these states to destroy Trump and to win the election for Biden.
Loudon says Liberation Road runs 2 different Chinese progressive associations, one in California's Bay Area and another in Boston. The Boston branch openly works with Chinese communist officials, even holding an event for a Chinese consulate. Liberation Road and both CPAs do voter outreach and registration, and they're openly anti-Trump.
And these are communist groups. These are groups that owe their allegiance to Communist China, and they are boasting about winning the election. You know, if you're a leader of the Communist Party of China, would you really want this guy, Trump, in the White House for 4 more years? After all he's done to counter your plans? Or would you use your assets in the United States to try and tip the scales in favor of a much more friendly candidate like Joe Biden?
The Biden family has had extensive business relationships with China, and the Democratic candidate has shown little concern about Communist China during his election campaign compared to President Trump. Miguel Moreno, NTD News.
According to leaked documents recently obtained by our sister media, the Epoch Times, a U.S. university is helping China develop its satellite navigation system. This system could be used by China's military. The documents from China's Lanzhou Jiaotong University in Gansu Province shows it has signed 2 agreements with North Illinois University, or NIU, to send 15 Chinese scholars and students within a 2-year period. They will study geographic information science at NIU. One of the programs started in August this year. The Chinese university said the program would assist in fully deploying China's veto system. China's veto satellite navigation system has both civilian and military applications. However, Beijing developed it primarily for military purposes. Veto satellite navigation system is made to rival the United States GPS system. According to a Chinese news site, the director of China's Xinjiang Satellite Application Engineering Center said our Chinese weapons cannot rely on GPS. Once the United States turns off GPS during a war, our weapon system will be paralyzed. It's much safer to use our own navigation system. The director added that in the Xinjiang region, Beto's most important use is to maintain the Communist Party's rule and stability by surveilling its citizens. Now to Australia, where the federal government will now have the power to veto any deal struck between local authorities and foreign governments. Local lawmakers approved the legislation on Thursday. Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison has stressed the new law is not aimed at any one country, but the move is widely seen by analysts as directed towards China. Under the new law, Australia's foreign minister can veto agreements made by local institutions if they adversely affect Australia's foreign relations or the inconsistent with Australian foreign policy. One example of a possible veto may be the cooperation between Chinese authorities and Australian state Victoria on the Belt and Road Initiative. That refers to Beijing's global infrastructure project, widely known to help the communist regime expand its influence overseas. An Australian lawmaker and businessman called for a boycott of Chinese goods after Beijing imposed high tariffs on Australian products. According to local media, Sam Kinnard, the CEO of Australian self-storage company Kinnards, called on other businesses in his country on Wednesday to cut ties with Chinese suppliers. He said to News Corp Australia's NCA Newswire, the Chinese Communist government has proven to be difficult to trust. He added the CCP placed tariffs on Australian lobster, wine, and barley out of revenge or spite, and the risk is you just don't know who is next. Kinnard's call came after Australian Senator Pauline Hanson urged consumers to boycott made-in-China products this December. Now we look to a lawsuit between a South Korean bank and a Chinese insurer. South Korean biggest investment bank Mirai Asset Daewoo won a U.S. court case against Chinese Anban Insurance Group. A court document showed Mirai scrapped a $5.8 billion deal after the start of the pandemic to buy 15 U.S. hotels from Anban. The case was filed in Delaware. It could set a precedent for deals that assets values drop, and buyers no longer want to buy them under the previous agreements. The court document showed Mirai agreed last year to buy the hotels from Anban, but Mirai did not close the deal this April as scheduled, saying that Anban's representations and warranties were inaccurate. This led Anban to file the suit, saying Mirai must fulfill its promised payment. The court found that the Anban company made extensive changes to its hotel business because of the pandemic, such as employee layoffs, furloughs, and closing amenities, and this allowed Mirai to terminate the agreement. Anban was one of the biggest insurers in China. Its asset once had reached nearly $300 billion. In 2017, Anban's chairman Wu Xiaohui was detained in Beijing and later sentenced to 18 years imprisonment for what the court called fraud and embezzlement. In 2018, the Chinese regime took control of the insurer. The company has since been liquidated, and some of its assets have been placed in another insurance group. Some of them have been sold. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching, and see you tomorrow.